I'm delighted to introduce Katherine Moline, who is chairing this session with Ian McArthur and Judy Watson. So Katherine is Associate Professor at UNSW Arts, Design and Architecture. Her research focuses on the dynamics between technological and social forces in art and design. Her analyses of experimental design are published in Undesigned Critical Practices at the Intersection of Art and Design and Food Democracy, Critical Lessons in Food Communication, Design and Art. Her innovations in research methods have also been documented in Uncertainty and Possibility, New Approaches to Future Making in Design Anthropology. Please make Katherine and the panel welcome. Thank you.
It's great to see an audience there and to join the Data Imaginary Fears and Fantasies Symposium. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, past and present, of Gadigal country where I'm joining you from today. Sovereignty never ceded. I'd also like to thank Tia Uglo for her insights last night and her excellent book recommendation for Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions by Edwina Abbott, a social satire of Victorian England, in which objects, a square and a circle, meet on a piece of paper. A book titled Flatland seems apt as I introduce our panel on location data when we are all speaking from remote locations to a screen and a tiny green dot. Welcome to the two panellists who have generously agreed to discuss how their works in the Data Imaginary relate to our fears and fantasies about the quantitative measurement of everything, and in particular location data. Judy Watson and Ian McArthur. Before I introduce Judy and Ian, I just wanted to provide some context about location data and how we thought about it in the exhibition. Many works use located data, both poetically and algorithmically, in the show. The shell necklaces of Lola Greeno's in the exhibition and Sylvia Carter, who spoke on his work in this morning's panel, are top of mind right now. As the Data Imaginary Curatorium discussed the exhibition, we moved back and forth between the terms geolocated data and location data. What we wanted to find out was how artists and designers are thinking about place and/or repurposing the precise mapping technology of global positioning systems, GPS. As my catalogue essay notes, with satellite accuracy growing every day, it is now possible to monitor locations from a mobile device with an accuracy of 30 centimetres. Such precision creates expectations regarding what data can do and frustration when it turns out to have ambiguous grey zones, particularly as we have the Sydney bushfires in 2019-2020 summer and the current opaqueness about the COVID-19 cases. Now to the panellists. Judy Watson lives and works in Brisbane. Since graduating from the University of Southern Queensland in 1979, the University of Tasmania in 1982 and Monash University in 1986, Judy has developed artworks with printmaking, drawing, painting and installation and public art that often explore themes relating to her Aboriginal heritage. Watson's matrilineal family is from the Wanyi country in northwest Queensland, and her work is inspired by traditional Wanyi culture. Watson often uses archival resources, documents and photographs from the extensive documentation of Aboriginal people in Australia. She describes discovering how her ancestors were treated as a heavy burden. To add to Judy's modest bio in the Data Imaginary catalogue, I'd also like to note that she co-represented Australia in the 1997 Venice Biennale and has exhibited works such as Waterline at the Australian Embassy in Washington, DC, 2011, the Sydney Biennale, 2012. A major exhibition of her work titled The Edge of Memory was held at the Art Gallery of New South Wales in 2018. Judy's public artworks include Fire and Water at Reconciliation Place, Canberra, and Narunga Nangama, Calm Water Dream on George Street in Sydney, 2016. And most recently, Borough on the Botanical Gardens overlooking the Sydney Opera House, featured on our foreshore, which opened finally this year in 2022. Judy Watson will be speaking about the research and artworks that combine in her work the names of places 2015. This video installation shows the place names of massacre sites across maps of Australia and images of Watson's works of art in a complex intersection of place and data. The names of places represents the substantial work over decades that Judy has dedicated to documenting the widespread massacres of Aboriginal people by British invaders. Over to you, Judy.
I'm Judy Watson. I'm with 1 year matrilineal heritage, living in Brisbane, Yagara Turrbal peoples here in Brisbane. In terms of the research that went into the names of places, it came from an idea of trying to have a listing of sites, which are massacre sites across Australia. And I really started with the idea of what had been recorded in books and stories and histories and speaking to historians and archivists, etc. And at that stage, I had a number of books that I sort of knew about some of the research already. And I also engaged Freya Carmichael to look through and find some of the names of places too, and just started a listing of names really. And when you see the actual work in the video, it's like a spool of discredits because it's like a rolling sort of alphabetical viewing of some of the names, and it's over the top of some maps, and then it's also over the top of some artworks, previous artworks of mine. So Freya Carmichael, there was Indy Mediarios working with me at the time. Greg Hooper came in and did the video compositing of some of my imagery and overlays, and also the sound composition, and the video editing was done by Jared Lee. So that was the 2016 version. We might go to next, please. Next slide, thanks. So you can sort of see, you can see the overlays here, and as the video moves through, it is like you're sort of moving across country, and maps the various maps like tenure maps, etc., of country. And it's really important for me to use some of those maps because a lot of them are stations and place names that I know from my mother's family's history where they've lived and worked on properties. We'll go to next, please. And this one here, you can see it's the Flinders map of Australia. And I like the idea of using the Matthew Flinders map because it's a very artistic map in some ways, but it's also fairly generic. It doesn't necessarily line up with the current map of Australia. It does and it doesn't, but it's something that's very well known visually, but it's also something where when we ended up doing the digital map, and that was working with both Greg Hooper, Angus Hooper, and Jonathan Richards was supplying data at the time. Place names were sort of, or massacre sites were placed onto the map, but you couldn't see exactly which part of the country it was in. You got a bit of an idea, like it might be Maryborough, it might be Gympie, it might be close to there. And then as you zeroed in on it, then you could actually see, if you clicked on it, there would be data and manuscripts and things like that coming up. Unfortunately, that map is no longer online, and I can talk about that. So this one here just shows you how the alphabetical listing of the names of places which came up in initial research, and this was very initial research back in 2016, came to be sort of used, and it was using American typewriter script because I like the look of it. You know, it's very clinical in a way, journalistic, bit old-fashioned, and it sort of just sat on there, and you could imagine it clicking on these names and then spooling through. Next slide, please. One of my cousins on my non-Aboriginal side sat through. Where weren't there massacres? And that is something that actually is an interesting take on it because there are so many places around us in which there were massacres. I also consulted with like Ray Kirkove, who is one of the historians in Brisbane, as well as others. And he mentioned that there was one, sort of near Acacia Ridge. Now, one thing that was said about that, that's what was within his research. And at that time, I then was hearing about Lyndall Ryan, who was doing another map project, massacre map project. And she was a little bit more academic within hers, in that she was saying that there had to be at least 5 or 6 people for it to be called a massacre. Whereas I wasn't, I was taking my journey as an artist and just reacting to where I read that people had been killed. Okay, next, please. And these artworks underneath are from many things. In fact, this is from an artwork, One Night in Bhopal, talking about the Bhopal gas explosion. So there's many things that are being composited together. Next, please. And this next lot of work is some works on paper, which were made at the same time that I was making some work about Heron Island. And it was using various data supplied by scientific researchers, including Professor Ovo Goldberg, Bradley Congdon, and Kathy Townsend. And it was after doing an artist in residency on Heron Island and hearing these scientists, among others, talk about the impact of climate change on the Great Barrier Reef. And they were showing various slides that included data, and I asked their permission to use some of that data. And that, you can look it up on Judy Watson Heron Island Suite, which is a series of etchings which includes the data within it. But these then were works on paper, drawn watercolour basically over the top of scientific data. Next slide, please. And these two works here on the left, on the left is Water Dragon, and that's a geospatial tracing of the Brisbane River in flood in 2011, the 2011 January floods. And it's called Water Dragon. And you can see the ochre sort of lines actually showing the map, the flood line itself as it's coming up and going across. That sort of triangular shape, almost like basket form, that sort of zooms into the neck up the top, is Kurilpa. On the right part of that triangle shape is where Gorman is, the State Library, Performing Arts Centre, etc. And my studio wasn't very far from there. And Angela Goddard will remember helping us to move things from the boxes from the studio up to Richard Bell's studio on the top floor in Brereton Street during that time. And down the bottom are some charts, which are the financial charts that I grabbed out of the newspaper on the day that the flood peaked, which was the 13th of January, because I think it's interesting to look at what's happening in the financial charts during particular disasters, and how it plays out as well. So that one is Water Dragon, and I did write something about it. I sort of said it was the idea of how the floods linked at contemporary history along the edge of the city, coalescing with the Aboriginal history at Kurilpa, place of the Water Rack. And Montague Road, close to here, is formerly an Aboriginal walking track with the lagoons along its edges and the Brisbane River Maiwar running beside it. Magill, the eastern water dragon, could be the creature dancing across the space via the red ochre mapped images of the Brisbane River and flood. And the white snake-like form is a riverline at Kurilpa. The water dragon's a shapeshifter for other creation ancestors, such as the rainbow serpent, or in a Brisbane context, a freshwater eel. And the rich brown flood waters merge with a wash of red ochre and blood, fixing time and place with its staining and pooling of colour. And the white and black rectangles, triangles and motifs are the financial reports facing off towards each other. So water has a memory. It follows the topography of country, connecting and submerging all of us within its wake. The one in the next slide on the right comes from the it's a sort of a map showing all the springs within the Gulf country, and it comes from a chart that shows that 80% of the springs which were operating when they were first identified during colonisation of Queensland, the Gulf country, are no longer operating. So it's just a note on how colonisation, climate change, and divisive practices such as the exploding of springs, which certainly happened within our country, has led to many of these springs no longer being viable. Next slide, please. And these are some more of the charts which have been sort of overlaid with watercolour or wash, which were, and imagery of coral, etc., part of the coral bleaching, acidification, and, you know, sea surface temperature rising charts, etc., which are derived from the scientists from the Great Barrier Reef. I'm not sure how much time I've got, so I'm happy to pass over to the next person or to answer questions.
Thank you. Great. I would now like to introduce Ian McArthur, our second panellist today. Ian is a hybrid practitioner working in the domains of experimental interdisciplinary practice, transcultural collaboration, sound art, experimental radio, meta design, and educational change. His research projects include the development of MadLab, an urban research platform in Chongqing, southwest China, in collaboration with industry partners, Friesman Architects and Cubed, for the development of projects that connect education, research and industry, and in effect incubate new site-specific mediated and issue-based concepts for the future of cities. This intersects with Ian's research investigating the development of participatory design methods using large urban screens as diagnostic tools for urban planning with researchers and practitioners based in Australia and China. Ian is currently working on an Australian Research Council DECRA titled MetaPlace, and his presentation today is titled The Other Data, in which he asks questions. What happens in the spaces between the ubiquitous nodes of urban data? How might artists learn by giving the elderly phones to track their movement around local communities? Which mapping tactics help us understand contemporary cityness? This presentation discusses ways artists and designers could generate data, enabling local governments and urban planners to design better by involving citizens directly in decisions about the places they live, work and play. The Data Imaginary Curatorium included MetaPlace in the first iteration of the exhibition at Griffith University Art Museum in 2021. Over to you, Ian.
I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Darug and Gundungurra people, where I live in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, and of course acknowledge leaders past, present and future, and also that sovereignty over this land was never ceded. Okay, it looks like I can share my screen now, and here we go. I'm thinking that you can see my screen now, which is great. Okay, so I'm going to approach the theme of this session through the lens of participatory mapping because, as Katherine suggested, this is where my research and practice and my teaching as an associate professor at UNSW Art and Design intersect with the questions that this session raises. So after kind of giving my take on the global positioning system that Katherine mentioned, I'll talk about the context of my work and the industry collaborations leading up to the project that was exhibited in the Data Imaginaries program in Brisbane. And as you can see, I've titled my presentation The Other Data because I want to draw attention to not only the ubiquitous networked nodes of data that the global positioning system is generating across the planet, but also because I'm actually interested in the data that can be derived from the spaces in between the links and nodes. data that represents how people live, what they think, the communities they live in, the things they aspire to. And I'm aware that to an extent this is a little paradoxical, as anyone familiar with the Chinese cultural context I position much of my work within will understand. But I'm using Meijia's adaptation of the neuroscientific terminology of the paranoid as a means to illustrate this, because such spaces are typically rendered as emptiness. But those spaces, the paranoid, they're not empty. They're actually overflowing with data, and this is the other data to which I refer to in the title of my presentation. So fundamentally, my work asks, how can we employ pluriversal and participatory and co-design methods to gather data about cities in ways that make urban life better? Okay, so the inspiration and context for my recent body of work from, say, 2015 to now is the extraordinary megacity of Chongqing in southwest China. Now, for Chinese people, Chongqing is extremely famous, but for Westerners, actually many don't know it exists, despite it being one of the largest and most rapidly urbanizing cities in the world. It's got a municipal population of around 32 million people. And its invisibility to the West kind of underscores my point about the spaces between the nodes of information we possess or are aware of. And I think it's a neat correspondence to our inherent nodocentrism that Chongqing, despite its immense size and our entwined relationality to China, it's far less visible in our region than the nodes and links between Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, or Hong Kong. It lies beyond the nodes and links defining our awareness. But as a city, it's ideal as a research subject for many reasons. It's an urban multiplicity that exemplifies China's complex, hybrid, traditional and futuristic culture that's so misunderstood by Westerners. So I'm going to show examples from MadLab, the mapping and design laboratory I co-founded in 2012, because it's a critical contextual building block for MetaPlace, the work that's been a part of the Data Imaginaries exhibition. So MadLab links together educators, students, researchers, and industry and government professionals through collaborative partnerships within Chongqing's creative industries, government, and universities. We have student researchers from Australia and China as participants. And MadLab's participants come from design and design-related curriculum areas at UNSW, at Chongqing Sichuan Fine Arts Institute, and the School of Architecture, Design and Planning's Design Lab at the University of Sydney. And we approach mapping and data gathering about Chongqing's unique urban context through the lens of a range of mapping processes as methodology to generate data-driven urban narratives through experimentation, observation, storytelling, journeys, film and design interventions, audiovisual recordings, augmented realities, and experimental cartographic techniques, as well as deep consultation with industry partners, for example, Priestman Architects, pictured here. And we connect participants directly to local creative practitioners, for example, in the jewelry, ceramics, and architecture fields. We link them up with studio spaces, local sites of interest and significance. We create events, we encourage them to create events, and we build a kind of social dimension to the project as well. And we send our participants out into the city to explore how the desires, culture, and behaviours of people shape the urban fabric by engaging with a range of morphological, interpretive, critical, emotional, and experimental derive-like strategies to record the thoroughfares, pathways, hierarchies, continuities, and discontinuities, and relationalities of urban space. So MadLab sees the Chinese city, and particularly emerging megacities like Chongqing, as a laboratory for the future. Why is this important? Well, to illustrate, Tom Miller, editor of the China Economic Quarterly in 2012, suggested that by 2030, not very far away, 1 in 8 people on Earth will live in a Chinese city. Now, clearly, assuming that's true, that's quite significant. Yet we still, as Westerners, know so little about the actuality of Chinese urban life. This image shows some of our participants in 2015 gathering visual participatory data directly from citizens on the street about how they feel about the city. Now, our approach over the years has produced very diverse data sets that tell us about what we've come to describe as Chongqingness. Knowledge that we could never obtain from purely digital or traditional cartographic modes of mapping the city. For example, these diagrams explore the relationship between 3 types of sensory data, light, sound, and smell, in a particular area of Chongqing. And we develop site-specific industry briefs in collaboration with local community leaders and local government. And this creates lots of direct contact with the people in the communities, meeting people and hearing what their lives are like and the things they aspire to for their communities, their homes, streets, local cultures, economies, and ways of living. And our participants map connections between community housing and street, for example, to generate useful planning data and investigate opportunities in these relationships, and to propose solutions and interventions. And that process of creating and reinterpreting these mappings informs and supports our design proposals. These experimental participatory approaches to community consultation can yield surprising yet very pragmatic concepts for making urban life better. And of course, we do make use of the network. This project's a favourite of mine, actually, where participants collaborated with community members using mobile phones to map daily movements around Huangzhuping. And the GPS-derived data produced by those journeys became the conceptual basis for a design proposal for lighting dark entranceways to the dilapidated local public housing in the area. So all of this work sets the scene for MetaPlace, which is my work in the Data Imaginaries exhibition program. As Katherine mentioned, it's an ARC-funded DECRA project. And again, it's a collaborative project involving creative industries, academics, and government partners. And it's a project that seeks to investigate if it's possible to use networked urban media to gather data and to use this for better placemaking and planning. The research began in Sydney with the testing of a reproducible approach for identifying how to program urban screens so that they generate useful planning and placemaking data, really, reflecting a very specific physical and socio-cultural environment. And that involved the design and development of methods for facilitating citizen-generated content, participatory voting processes, and large-scale public data visualization of crowdsourced content. And this explores the use of urban screens and personal devices, such as tablets and iPads, situated in public space as platforms for diagnosing the needs of the city and its citizens. And as Chongqing is a city where the presence of urban media at all scales, from the skyscraper to the personal mobile phone, is completely omnipresent, it's an ideal case study for exploring the potential of this kind of diagnostic participatory method for digital placemaking. Now, as you might imagine, the pandemic and the high-level tensions between China and Australia have prevented us from conducting iterative testing in Chongqing so far. But we've used this as an opportunity to focus on unpacking the co-design and participatory processes that unfolded in the workshops that we staged in Chongqing prior to the pandemic, with a range of industry, government and academic stakeholders. And many assumptions about design research were significantly challenged in this space, revealing the limitations of Eurocentric, Western understandings about the use and context of data, about what design and co-design is, what it's for, how it's conducted. And the video about MetaPlace featured on the Data Imaginaries website discusses these findings and outcomes of the research in greater depth if you're interested. Suffice to say that the outcomes of the project to date are not as we anticipated in this visualization when we started in 2019. What we see at the Data Imaginaries exhibition is an app, really, phone-based, that represents the project at a much more intimate scale. Less public, completely anonymous. And if you're interested, you could follow the QR code to see an iteration of the MetaPlace app set up for the FUMA show. There isn't much data in it yet. I think probably because it's not very visible part of the exhibition, at least compared to the Brisbane show. But thanks for your attention.
Now we're going to move into a Q&A with Judy, and following that we'll come back to Ian and talk to him, or I'll ask questions and we'll have a discussion about aspects of the work and the exhibition. So, Judy, I wanted to first talk about the exhibition or the work in the show, The Names of Places, and ask you a question about the significance of massacre sites. When I first saw The Names of Places from 2015, in a review in The New Yorker in 2017, my first reaction was amazement that your work was documenting the unwritten history of violence in the colonisation of Australia. For the benefit of people who haven't seen Judy's work in the Data Imaginary, this is how the reviewer described it. Superimposed on the shaky, ever-moving boundaries of a map of Australia is a scrolling, alphabetised list of hundreds of massacre sites and images of other work by Watson on the same theme, such as Pale Slaughter, which lists weapons used, bayonets, revolvers, and the names of men, which lists perpetrators. Next to this video, Watson set up a touchscreen map that people could use to bring up historical documents associated with different massacres. The map is now online for anybody to explore, and visitors can share information, including hearsay, about massacres in their own communities. My second thought was that asking people to contribute to the names of places was a very powerful way to activate awareness of the true extent of massacres and really bring it home to people that the scale of the massacres, of the lives lost, and the widespread and bloodiness of the battles was moving and devastating during British colonisation. Your comment in an interview with Paula Bella in 2016 that it might be traumatic for people to know that there could be a massacre that happened literally in their backyard reminded me of how the work conjured up awareness of the significance of a place, being in a place, and the situatedness of knowing a place. So could you talk a bit about whether the significance of the massacre sites is starting to be commemorated in any way, and if that is something that you see as important? You mentioned the Myall Creek event in June of each year, where that battle is remembered in a walk with the descendants of the survivors and the perpetrators at Myall Creek. That was one example. Do you want to talk a bit more about how you see these sites being commemorated, or even if that's appropriate?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think the Myall Creek Memorial Walk is an amazing one that everyone can go to. And I think, for one thing, it's the Myall Creek Massacre is important in that it's the only time that I know that some of the perpetrators were brought to justice, the perpetrators being white men massacring Aboriginal, mostly women, children, and a couple of men at Myall Creek itself. In fact, there were about 28, but there probably were more. And the perpetrators, not all of them, the ringleader got away, but some of them were brought to justice and some of them were actually hung. And there's some really great books you can read about it. Remembering Mile Creek is one of them. There's many other ones too. And being part of the exhibition, which was curated by Bianca Beetson and organised with Niram, to be one of the participating artists and go along and be there for this momentous occasion was very, very powerful. And I feel like it's that walk together that everyone could go to. But the fact that, there are the descendants of the perpetrators and there are descendants of the survivors and there are lots of other people together, it's a way that we can all redefine our history and our place within it. And there's no, somebody saying, well, you're on the side of the perpetrators or you're on the side of the survivors or whatever it is. It's a reckoning and a recognition of what has happened and learning about it, participating to then pass it on, educate, and then realise we're all in this together and we have to deal with that history. It's really such a powerful thing. And I think if that was to happen in more places around Australia, so it's not hidden, it's not a hidden history, it's something which is actually just stating, the layers of history that lie beneath all of the places that we live and work in.
Thank you. My next question is about how you started collecting sites to document. So when developing the exhibition with the Data Imagining Curatorium back in 2019 and 2020, I traced the exhibition history of your work, The Names of Places. You first showed it in the exhibition Defying Empire, which was the third Indigenous National Arts Triennale at the National Gallery of Australia in 2017. 16, I think. But no, it was 2017. We've been fact-checking this morning. It's 2017.
Yeah.
But you've said that it was something you'd worked on since 1979 when you made the etching Death of a Race and then the work Sand Dreams in 1980. When we discuss the names of places, you've spoken about how your mother's cousin, Shirley McNamara, and her mother, Ruby Saltmere, told you and your family at your grandmother Grace's funeral that your great-great-grandmother, Rosie, escaped a massacre at Lawn Hill. You said that this made you think about your family as survivors from a long line of ancestors who have survived and that the history of survival lies within you. In developing the names of places, you worked with research historian Jonathan Richards. Could you talk a bit more about the processes that you used when you selected the sites to document the massacres?
Yeah, it was very much the very first names of places. I think it was actually first shown on the green screen. I was just looking again too at the IMA in 2016. And then it was shown at Defying It. No, but that's okay because it's hard to remember all those years ago. Then it was shown at Defying Empire at the NGA. Yeah, it was very much going back to the little that I knew and then doing more research about it, reading books, looking through and asking other people to do that, trawling through history. And that's when I said, I sort of employed Freya Carmichael to have a look at some of the books I had and basically go through it and just fact check. Okay, where does it say, a massacre, as you can see the states. Because that was done in 2016, there's a lot more names that aren't there and some of them might not have the right spelling. So it's a first attempt. Yeah. After that, we did put together, and that's when with Greg Hooper and Angus Hooper and Jonathan, we put together the digital map. Unfortunately, that went offline. And this is, I'm not very, I'm very inept when it comes to digital things. I must have missed a subscription, reminder to then, pay up for Esri. And so it just went off air. And Nina CPAC, who is a young person, daughter of a friend of mine, who's an artist, Donna Marcus. She is now working on in spatial geography sort of area, and she's having a go at trying to get it up again. But once again, this is all done. It's not funded. It's just something we're sort of trying to put together. And I think it'd be great if someone else were to host it, because maybe it wouldn't forget the subscription, or not get the email that, I obviously missed. So, but this is human error. And I have an idea as an artist to do things, but I don't necessarily know how to do it. And so I work with all these amazing people, and they're the people who get these things up.
Yeah.
And in a way, the reason I was made to think about this was listening to an art curator at the British Museum from Uganda, who was talking about how every year he and various people would go to a site in Uganda where there was a massacre, and they had this, it was a bit of sort of like concrete, like a park, and the women would come and dance on the park, and it was to remember, those who'd been massacred. And there was a whole series of things which were performed in order to remember and never forget what happened. And I just sort of thought that's what we should have in Australia. That's what made me, I want to do the names of places, because I don't want these places to be forgotten. And as it is, some of the names are horrendous, Some of them are still there, and you can see them on the map, and I won't say them aloud because they're quite derogatory, but they're all there, and some of them have been whitewashed and covered over. But I want us to never forget those names.
Okay. I've just been texted that I need to wrap up, which is a shame because we've got all these other fabulous questions. I wondered if I could just have a quick Q&A with Ian, if that's okay, Administrator.
Yes, absolutely fine. Just jumping in there. And actually, I think you've got another 5. So, okay. have a question with Ian for sure. Thanks.
Thank you. Oh, Ian, all this, which of the questions will I ask you? So last night, Tia started her keynote with the question, what are the data points we would collect if we were in the same room, and would we listen more carefully? So your extensive research on participatory data collection, titled Metaplace, through urban screens in China, really resonated for me with Tia's questions. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about, I'm merging a couple of questions here. You can talk about either stakeout and derive, which you mentioned one of the slides, because when I saw that I did laugh out loud, but also cultural practices and data, because over the years we've talked about our different research in how people use their mobile phones and how people use data, and compared notes on how co-design can really engage with that space, because we work in that area, although on separate projects. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about your ideas on the differences in how people from different locations work with data, how they regard their privacy, how they deal with their mobile phone.
Okay, so you want me to talk about that last part? Like, there's a lot there. You've questions.
Two questions together.
Okay, so you mentioned the derive and the stakeout. They're two of the mapping methodologies that we use in MadLab. We use the derive in a number of ways, but fundamentally it's based on Debord's kind of notion of the drift through the city. We use it as a way to encounter the city, to see it through new eyes, to respond in an emotionally kind of direct way. Whereas the stakeout, we actually encourage our participants to iterate on kind of, the methodologies that we kind of give them as provocations. And the stakeout is an adaptation of pretty standard industry standard practice in terms of architecture and planning. It's based on observing a site, and it's just an iteration on that came from some of the students where they go to a site and that they observe what happens. That's pretty much that. In terms of culture and data, working in China has been kind of fascinating. I've worked in China, as you know, for a long time, and I'm reminded of the first pandemic, the SARS outbreak in the early 2000s. Well, I was at that time I was running a department at one of the universities in Shanghai, and SARS happened, and it kind of coincided with vacation. And so all our students were going off all around China, and we kind of really needed to understand where they were they safe, and so forth. And what we found is it was really, really difficult because there's this tendency to make themselves completely anonymous. And so we had this real challenge trying to track people. If we kind of fast forward to now, I'm reminded of things that seem quite controversial, at least in the way they're reported in Western media. Things like China's social credit system, which Westerners are very concerned with privacy and metadata and so forth. And that kind of program by the Chinese government's really reported in a very negative light. But if you look at the data around, the acceptance and even the embrace of that system in China, something like around 80% of the population they view it favorably. So I guess what I'm saying is that different cultures view data and their experience of data and surveillance in different ways.
It's fascinating. I'm seeing the same thing with different mobile experiments with people, in my case, with students from South Korea. So totally open about how they would share their phones and share anything on their phones. They didn't have the same sense of privacy that we have in the West. And at the same time, that because they would access stuff while they were, say, in Australia that may be illegal in Korea, I'll leave that to your imagination, they would then completely empty their phones before they went back home. So they knew how to manage their data in far more sophisticated ways than we did, because I guess their governance system was, just engage with their citizens much more through the phone. So I'm opening the floor now and the panel to questions from in the room or other people.
So I'll just ask if there's anyone in the room with a question for our panel or anything on the Slido. No further questions from in the room or on Slido. Tully, would you like to make a comment or an observation? Yes, Tully would like to.
Oh, well, just first of all, thanks for those two really, really fascinating presentations and insights. And I guess I'm thinking about the work that our perception or representation of space, which is what really draws those two presentations together, what that work does. So on the one hand, maybe the work is on the one hand trying to pull back from the map and see the presence of the violence that has happened in those spaces. And then on the other hand, it's about planners needing to not think so abstractedly about the space, but actually find ways of using data to be present inside the space in the moment in which they're needing to make decisions about that space. And I'm just wondering if there's, kind of like an interesting tension there between, humans as ways of interacting with data that needs to go big and then hone in, and whether we always have a form of whiplash when we try to do that work.
Any response?
Ian, do you want to have a go?
The thing that comes to mind when thinking about that is it's actually one of the motivations for me doing what I'm doing is obviously because I'm interested in cities and data and technology. This very contested term of the smart city, is a part of the thinking that I'm engaged in. And I think a lot of the ways smart cities are perceived and have been kind of used is in a very instrumentalist kind of top-down, technocratic, quantitative kind of way. And for me, I'm not so interested in that. I'm much more interested in the human and the human-centered and even the more than human-centered approach to understanding what the city is and how we can use smart technologies in ways that kind of embrace that kind of realm of the experience of cities. Yeah, that would be my response, my first initial response to that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Judy, we've spoken a bit about that map, the Matthew Flinders map that you've based names of places on. Do you want to speak about that idea of whiplash and sort of zooming in and out of a map and a site in your work?
Yeah, I think when I first travelled to Europe, I remember meeting somebody who had the Pelican history of the world, and it meant that you looked at a place, like, for example, I met this person in Morocco, and you looked at a place and then it went from the very, very beginning all the way through. And I think that's the way that I like to look at things. I like to see what's happening on the ground at a place, and then I want to go back and back and back and back. And then you can sort of, go off on the side on all sorts of tangents. But that's where I think the idea of mapping or location finding or data, all those sorts of things is really interesting. Because, of course, as a traveller, I'm like a cultural vessel and I have my own history within me. But then there is this thing where you're overlapping with other cultures and other histories, and that's moving in and out of view in a way. And so we're all reacting differently to places. And the Matthew Flinders map, I think it's a very beautiful map, but also when I see certain places on it, I also know that I've made work in reference, for example, where the investigator, the boat that Matthew Flinders was in, say went to the Gulf of Carpentaria and landed at Swears Island, and there was what's called the investigator tree, where both the investigator boat, sort of carved in the name of the investigator boat. Darwin's the Beagle boat, they did the same thing. So there's almost like a desecration in some ways of a tree, but in other ways it would be seen as a beautiful, sort of historic monument, to these boats passing through. So I think there's always dual, and yet, and that's sometimes seen like Burke's tree as more important than a scar tree, where shields and canoes and things are cut out of trees. So I'm always interested in layers of history and layers of representation within maps and sites.
And that's something I like how you're talking about the spaces and sites moving through us, and that we carry sites with us. It's beautiful. Maybe it's different to whiplash. It was that feeling of zooming in and out. Thank you.
Oh, I think you do get that, though. You sort of look at something and then you suddenly realise, oh, wow, is that what happened here? And that's a whiplash. Like if you learn about a site's history, that's the whiplash to pull you back into the present.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. Any other questions from people in the room?
Any final questions? I think everyone might be hungry over here.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Fiona.
I'll just get up to the main mic and thank you all again. Please join me. Another fabulous session. And I will just a little bit something about Judy's work. I mean, she's talking about the Matthew Flinders maps. Judy actually worked with us in 2016 when Flinders University was celebrating its 50th anniversary, and she was commissioned to make a work of art as part of the redevelopment of the plaza area, which is just out here. So if you've got a moment over lunch, you might like to go and have a look at that work. It's a group of feathers which relate to Jilburuki, the Agana ancestor, but also you can see the layering of the Flinders maps onto those sculptures. So I think it was very fitting that we ended there with a reference to Matthew Flinders.